colleagues. On behalf of the BMF Western Cape, Cape Town branch, I would like to welcome you all to another installment of the coaching series, one of 6. This will be the 4th one, and we will be looking specifically at coaching and organizational culture, optimizing diversity and commonality. So we will go through that session with 2 very qualified coaches who I'll introduce shortly. My name is Tulani Dube, by the way. I am part of the Western Cape Provincial Leadership Structure. I would like to introduce Ms. Kanyo Ngwenya to officially welcome you. She is the chairperson of the Century City branch in the Western Cape.
Thank you so much. Good evening, colleagues, and a warm welcome to all of you this evening. As Tulani has said, my name is Kanyo Ngwenya. I'm the chairperson of the Century City branch, and I'm going to share the opening remarks on behalf of the BMF. I'm going to be sharing the opening remarks, just focusing on the leadership development. Leadership development is critical in order to maintain and keep organizations relevant and profitable. One of the first lessons of John Maxwell's book, which is titled 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, he speaks about the law of the lid. The law of the lid, he states that it is the limit of the organization's leadership capability and in the lid on the overall ability of a business to perform, meaning that leadership development should be one of the key activities for corporates. The BMF has always promoted the culture of development of human capital, particularly managerial leadership development. Managerial leadership development expands the capacity of individuals to perform leadership roles, which facilitates executions of company strategy through building alignment and growing capabilities of others. As the BMF, we also believe that creating the pipeline of managerial talent would help organizations and our country in having a sustainable pool of critical skills which will contribute to the country's economic development. Both our vision and missions speak to the development and empowerment of managerial leadership of African Black people and the creation of managerial structures and processes that reflect the demographics and the values of our country. The BMF is the voice of transformation, inclusion, and diversity. We have partnered and continue to partner with key strategic stakeholders and offer our members the following leadership programs. We have partnered with Duke CE, where we offer the BMF and Duke Management Leadership Action Program, which is a 12-month program, and this program provides a focus in training and management and leadership, ensuring that candidates are prepared to lead effectively and improve organizational performance. We also partner with GIBS and WITS Business School annually to offer 5 MBA bursaries that are fully funded. We also have our own in-house annual program, which is the YP Development Program, which equips young professionals with middle management skills. The BMF is positioned to give expression and leadership on development and empowerment of managerial leadership talent. The development of strong Black leaders will ensure the upliftment of both disadvantaged and Black communities. The BMF clearly understands the needs of Black leaders, and we can articulate these. As the BMF, we have a strong duty to assume the advocacy role on affirmative action and transformation to ensure that there will be enough skilled Black leaders that can meaningfully contribute to the needs of our economy. As a BMF, we are proud of our contributions that we've made in the 45 years of our existence. As we continue our theme of leadership development through coaching, we are excited to bring you this evening's coaching session, which is curated and is being facilitated by accredited Black leadership coaches with an aim to enhance your leadership abilities. I'd like to encourage you to all fully participate in the session and interact with our coaches. And hopefully you will learn something valuable that you can apply in your own leadership journey. Thank you, colleagues. and
Thank
over to
you.
you, Tulani.
Thank you, Kanyo. Appreciate the opening. I think it's very important, like as Kanyo said, we're trying to make this as participative as possible, and we would appreciate your comments, your questions with the two credible coaches, as Kanyo said. So just to give you a brief background, on your screen is Untate Mohadi Mate, who is the national chairperson of COMENSA, Coaches and Mentors of South Africa. He also holds 3 master's degrees and has been working with C-suite executives, teams, and coaching them for performance improvement strategies. Also, Ilona Hladrayo is a PhD candidate, a member of COMENSA as well, psychometrist registered with the Health Profession Council of South Africa. I can go on with the list, which is quite extensive, but I will leave it at that so that at least we try to get to the matter of the day and take it from there. Obviously, we've been building on from the first session, talking of the importance of coaching, the importance of mentorship, and up to where we are. I think I would like to take this in a conversation form and maybe start by really defining what culture is in this particular context as we bring it, and values as well, and then how coaching can improve one's performance thereof. So maybe posing it to both of you, Ilona and Tate Mohadi, as a start, just to give you your narrative of culture and values, and we take it from there.
I'm keeping quiet because I wanted Ilona to start.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why later.
Oh, wow.
But while I'm still talking, Ilona, maybe before you start, I just wanted to add, Tulani, if I may, that not only is Ilona a member of COMENSA, she's actually a director and also the chairperson of the research committee within COMENSA, just as an addition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, everybody. Tulani, if I heard your question clearly, you would like to get my understanding of culture and values.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So culture is very broad, and I just want to frame it for this evening's conversation. So you have national culture and global culture that we fall under. But knowing the realities in South Africa, we have also our ethnic culture and so on. Culture being a way of doing things, which is informed or the components of it could be our value systems, what we believe. Our past feeds into our culture. So as individuals, we contribute to a group culture, which could be in your organization. When you move from one company to another, you find that there's certain values and things that they value, agreed values, shared values, or those that are not even communicated, but you can still say in this organization, this is what is valued from how people behave, what is accepted and what is not accepted. So in the organizational perspective, it will speak to what sort of behaviors are acceptable. If somebody were to describe what type of culture, is it formal? Is it informal? Do people dress up? Can people arrive at 10 a.m.? Now I'm speaking to BMF in Cape Town. I actually quite miss what time corporate starts in Cape Town. And that's a good example of organizational culture, as opposed to, when I moved to Gauteng, people will ask for meetings at 7 in the morning. So that was a culture shock, an organizational culture shock for me. And it could be deeper items besides what time work starts. It could be formal processes of communication. It could be informal. How does it work between manager and subordinate, and so on? So all those things are components and things that you can actually see and describe about an organization's culture. And from my description, you can see that who we are contributes to how we show up in those spaces. So if I've been raised in a very punitive culture, sometimes you might find that you go into a workspace that's very laid back, and you might find that it's difficult to adapt because what you're used to is formal and rigid and bureaucratic and hierarchical. So I hope I'm answering you.
Yes. Dr. Mohadi, would you like to add to that?
Certainly, Thulani. Colleagues, good evening, and thank you, Ilona, for the intro on what culture is, and you looked at it broadly speaking. I want to focus on organizational culture as an addition to what has already been said. And I think what is important is that as we look at organizational culture, we need to be looking at the values that a particular organization will embrace as a way of saying this is how we do things within this organization. But also what is also important over and above culture, there might be certain expectations that the organization will stand for or anticipate achieving over a particular defined period. That would also form part of their organizational culture. And you might want to also say, are there policies within these organizations that guides them into their tomorrow or the vision for tomorrow? That would also form part of their organizational culture. Expectations, as I said, what are the expectations within this organization? But maybe let me also bring in the aspect of individuals within an organization that forms part of an organizational culture. And here I want us to look at individuals, but also look at collectives. And as we look at both individuals and collective who are part of a collective team, we need to be saying, what role does the collective play in promoting organizational culture? And how does individual contribution come into the space? If you then bring the aspect of values and you broaden them to say, what does this organization embrace as their values? I'll give examples. You might find organization that says, we stand for authenticity. You might find organization that says, as our value, transparency is important. Let's look at the two concepts. I mean, the list is endless. How authentic are members of the team in shaping up their own organizational culture? But also, how do the organization, and I guess through leadership, promote transparency and originality in the context of authenticity in the organization? That would be my contribution, Thulani, to your first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohadi. I think just a lead up to that, I'd like to say the issue of culture is determined by, especially for young professionals coming to an organization, they are getting into a system that's already fixed. Maybe just taking it back to Ilona and you, Baba Mohadi, how can coaching then assist one to find a voice to contribute to a particular culture or contribute to its change thereof, if so needed?
Should I go first?
Please do.
Okay, so in my experience, and that's usually when employees are transitioning in leadership. So perhaps from a a lower level to middle management, and then they have to now be in charge of others, and they're now almost expected to be ambassadors of this culture. That when I'm an individual, I can in my own way rebel or not subscribe to a certain culture, but once you become a leader and you're expected to almost take on that culture and promote it to your team, it becomes a different ball game, especially people who have an internal clash with some of the values and some of the things that they must communicate with excitement. And I think it ties in with what Mokadi was saying about authenticity, because how authentically can you do that if you actually don't align with what you need to do? So from a coaching perspective, you find that we say that sometimes management styles can be inherited. So a person will lead in the way in which they've been led. And that passes on some of the cultural aspects. I've coached in an organization where they had a legacy of bad leadership. And this bad leader had left 3 years ago. But every single manager that she had led in the way that they had been led. And it was so difficult to shift and say, actually, as an organization, we don't ascribe to this. We need to be more supportive and developmental, and aligned to our values. But their lived experience had almost superseded whatever was written down as the values. One person had an internal battle of, I like to listen to people and understand them, but I feel like that will make me look like a weak leader. So in terms of their personal values, it was important for him to listen to people, understand the why behind the behavior. But because he had been led in such a punitive way, there's something in him which kept saying, but you're not leading when you are understanding. And guess what? The values of the organization had what he presented, what I would say was in his DNA, to lead with understanding. But because in that same organization, he had not experienced that. So there's a difference between what organizations would communicate almost theoretically and what is the lived experience of the people in that team. So from coaching, we went through a process where we'll speak to what type of leader, what type of legacy do you want to leave behind? And that totally shifted things, because we're moving into the future and say, when you are long gone from this team, what do you want them to remember about you as a leader? And this specific person stopped referring back to the leader that they had and started to map and say, I want to be the leader that empowers others. I want to be this. It's almost like a blank canvas to say, what is it that you want in the future, despite what you've experienced before? What are the resources that you need to get there? What do you think you have already working for you that can help you get there? Oh, I naturally listen. I'm naturally considerate. It comes naturally for me to connect with people. And so you get the coachee to start to view themselves and their reality, to say, how practical is it for me to say, I want to be a leader who's understanding? What does the environment allow me to do? And then what are the actions that I need to be doing every day for me to be perceived as a leader that I want to be? Because we can say all the nice things, but in coaching, we hold you accountable to say, okay, when you say, I want to be a warm leader, what does that look like action-wise? How is your team going to experience that? What kind of things are you going to say? And how are you going to make sure that you consistently do it? So a coach is not only your thinking partner, but also your accountability partner, to keep you challenged by those goals that you set when it was exciting to say, I want to be that leader and that leader. And then you come back and say, actually, are you doing it? What is it looking like? What feedback are you getting from your team? What's difficult? And then how are we going to shift how you do things so that the messaging you're taking across is what you intended? Because you can say, I want to do this, but your actions might not land. Khadi, before it's a passion area.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilona. I think let me pick up from where you spoke about the legacy that the leader might want to leave. But as I do so, I think I also want to go back to what you said, Tulani. And I'm hearing you in two parts, where one, you are saying, here are aspiring young leaders who are joining organizations and they have the possibility of making a contribution towards the organizational culture. For me, I think the question should be, is the prevailing organizational culture at that point in time when they enter something that they want to be challenging? And if that be the case, you might find that the culture that's prevailing is such that it sort of creates chaos more than anything else. I think we should be coaching those young aspiring leaders to be courageous leaders. And by courageous leaders, I'm not necessarily saying they might be the ones that are leading the ship, but I'm just saying as they become part of the team, joining the team, they need to be courageous enough to say no to organizational cultures that are actually self-serving instead of serving the organization. And you might want to add in, is this organizational culture not only self-serving? Could it be that it is also an individualistic culture that should be perceived as an organizational culture? And how does coaching come into the equation? Remember, it is the very aspiring leaders that are joining these organizations that needs to be saying to us as coaches, these are our developmental areas that we are grappling with. If part of what they are grappling with would be organizational culture, of course, through the conversation we would have, we would go into details of what it is that they are grappling with. But coaching has the potential, as Ilona rightfully said, of holding those leaders accountable in the context of what is it that they want to achieve at the end of the coaching session. If we go into a coaching session, there is always something that you want to achieve. And therefore, making sure that you are articulate and clear in what it is that you want to achieve becomes something that as coaches we will focus on. Because ultimately, I will not bring the agenda items to a coaching session. It is the coachee that brings the agenda on the table. And we have this conversation based on what they want to achieve. But let me also, while I have this opportunity, maybe lament the fact that the majority of organizational cultures are actually more individualistic as opposed to being collective and representing the collective within the team. Because at the end of the day, we cannot be talking about organizational culture without necessarily looking at the impact of that culture to team cohesion, for example. How do members of the team interact with each other within the confines of this organizational culture? If it so happens that it is not working for the members of the team, I guess, Tulani, those that are new and coming in will be encouraged to be courageous enough to raise issues that are actually helping to shape up the organizational culture to serve the majority of the team members more than it would serve the few individuals within the organization. That would be my submission. Thank you.
Just Thanks, thanks, Ilona. Thanks, Ntate Mohadi. Just to follow up on that, can the coach actually help create a safe space, if I can say? Because I'm fully with Ntate Mohadi's submission that leaders need to be courageous, but in most cases, we get into very hostile situations, and if you're not in a position of power, at times your courage is greatly subdued. Does a coach actually strengthen this individual, or can you create a safe zone, or how will that work?
Thulani, are you speaking to a safe space for the individual within a team, or are you saying can coaching help somebody improve their confidence?
Something like that, but also taking into consideration that once the confidence has been lifted, they are operating within an environment where we're placing them back into that environment. Can we then, how do I put it? Does the coach actually influence that environment that they're in? Taking into consideration that regardless of what areas of focus I bring in, I'm still working within a particular environment. Can that coach then influence that?
Before I answer, I think there's great contributions in the chat. Just for your info, there's great answers to what we said earlier. There's a field of coaching or an approach of coaching called systemic coaching, and I subscribe to that, which basically acknowledges that as an individual, you're part of a system, be it your system in the workplace, your system at work. So for me, successful coaching is coaching you to be effective in the systems that you plug in. So who are your stakeholders as an individual? It's no use for me to coach you without an awareness of the team that you're going to go back and plug into. It's no use for me to coach you with no awareness of who are you leading, who are your peers, what type of feedback are you getting from there, and what do you want to shift there? Because then you go back and you have frustration. It could be me raising awareness that we've done this, but have you considered how this might land with your peers? Have you considered how this might land with your team or the people that you're reporting? It's very important when coaching somebody, when taking out one part of the whole, coaching that, and hoping that that person will make an impact or influence when they go back in. That is important to include in coaching sessions because you're not coaching them in a vacuum. So sometimes it's to us to say, okay, if you're saying this is the problem I'm experiencing, when you've achieved that, how would it be received in your space? Who else might be struggling with this problem that you have? If you say you're feeling you're not leading effectively, who else is impacted by this? And the person will tell you, my team, my peers, or even my manager. And so we coach with the stakeholders in mind as well, because the person needs to plug back into work and be more effective there. So that's my approach. It's very important to understand the stakeholders and who else is impacted, who else benefits. Why I also do that, it helps keep them accountable. So if in the beginning they told you, my whole team would be so relieved if I overcome this. And if they start to backtrack, how would your team feel if things were going as they are now? That's some of the ways to keep someone accountable. How important is it for you to go back into your system and you've improved this? And you hold them to account with that in mind.
I think
if I may add, Thulani, yeah, thank you, Ilona, for bringing up the aspect of systemic coaching. I think let me add as you might want to treat it as a synonym of some kind, where I want to talk about coaching from a holistic perspective. You look at an individual as a whole and not focus just on certain aspects of that individual. So holistically coaching a person would also take into account the stakeholders that interact with that individual. But I want to bring this aspect into this conversation, Thulani. I want to bring the aspect of self-esteem, self-worth, and to a point, self-confidence as well. It's one thing to coach an individual who is grappling with a particular issue. And I'm hearing you to be saying, yes, the coaching might be given, but this person still goes back to the same environment that he or she is operating under. The honor should be placed on the coachee. As a coach, I'm outside the environment that the coachee would be operating under. If the focus would be self-esteem or self-worth, as we were saying earlier, and bringing in the aspect of being courageous in dealing with the issues that they are grappling with, surely we would encourage the coachees through the coaching intervention to actually come up with interventions and options that would help them to deal with the issues that they are dealing with or grappling with. And what I mean by that is ultimately it is the coachee that should be saying what are or what is the best option in dealing with a particular issue, and bringing that within the context and the environment in which they operate in dealing with that specific issue. Ultimately, then let's learn from what Ilona has said, that from a systemic coaching perspective, we actually look at everything else around this individual. And it is by looking at everything around this individual that might help the coachee to become a better person. That would be my view on the matter, Thulani. Sorry, looks like I interrupted you.
No, not a problem. I was actually going to say there's a comment that actually agrees with Elona on that. Coaching allows the coachee to reflect on who they are and how they integrate with or in the opposite to the stated organizational culture. I also just want to maybe pose this to you in the interest of keeping it very engaging from Tsietsi, who asked in the chat, when we enter that coaching space, how do we cleanse or sanitize ourselves as coaches from our own cultural biases? So I think I'll pose that to Ndate Mkhadi first, then to Elona.
You know why I'm laughing, Thulani? Tsietsi is my colleague. And when he talks about sanitizing the biases that are there, it becomes very interesting coming from him, but I appreciate the question. I think let's be open and say cultural biases would always be there. It is our attempt as coaches on a continuous basis to actually sanitize ourselves. And the question is, how do we sanitize ourselves? Going into a coaching session, particularly where it talks about cultures, irrespective of what culture it is, going there without being an expert in that specific area, for me, would be part of sanitizing. Distilling yourself and purifying yourself to ensure that ultimately it is not how much you know, but it is how you interact with the coachee by becoming a thinking partner of that coachee in dealing with the issue at hand. I always say, as coaches, we need to move away from the perception that we create that we know it all, but let's rather demonstrate our know it all by being mindful of the fact that there are certain biases that we might carry as coaches as well. So attempts on a continuous basis to sanitize those becomes imperative in my view. So perhaps I'll do let me see if I will do a reverse technique on my colleague Tsietsi, to also towards the end actually come in and say, yes, I hear you talking about sanitizing, I hear you talking about purifying, I hear you talking about distilling, but what does he propose as the best option in making sure that we don't fall trap into these biases issues that sometimes we bring into the equation? Thanks, Thulani.
Thanks, Dr. Mukhadi. Alona, do you have any contributions to that?
Yes. So one of the things that I think are fundamental to coaching is being able to see things from another person's perspective. And I think that helps greatly to understand a situation through the eyes of the coachee as they speak to you. I'm going to tie this in with a comment around unconscious bias. So how does unconscious bias influence organizational culture and even in coaching? What happens is when it's unconscious, you can't do much about it. But when the unconscious becomes conscious, we have a responsibility to check ourselves and change our behavior. So, and being reflective, being self-aware, asking yourself, why did that trigger me? I mean, I sat in a coaching session this morning and a joke was passed that, oh my gosh, Zulus. And they started laughing. They're like, we need to be afraid of you guys because of what happened in the country last week. And I just noticed that I was still as the coach because I took it for what it was. But then I asked myself again, what made me still? You know, because I was able to look at it from her perspective, able to quickly tell myself, she's been watching the news. It's the reality of what's been happening in the country. So it's important to come out of yourself and sort of see what would make somebody else perceive me this way without being defensive, without being judgmental. And some of the removing of yourself of those layers, they need to know, they need to be the expert. Your client, the coachee, is the expert of their reality. So part of that is me saying, I need to accept when a person says, this is what's happened to me. I can't correct their reality. I can coach them through it, but I need to remember, what is my role in this conversation? Who is the expert here? You know, who is reporting about an issue in the boardroom? I may have seen 200 board meetings, but I was not in that one. So it's important to always check yourself to say, what's my role here? Am I coaching in the situation? Am I able to see broader? And what am I observing? But even if I'm observing, I'm still not the expert. The coachee is the one who owns the issue. What you are doing as a coach, you're facilitating thinking. But if they don't take your perspective, if you offer your perspective, it doesn't mean that they're uncoachable. So you can influence their thinking from whatever perspective, but it's important to check yourself as a coach to say, where am I standing in regard to this issue? You know, have they asked me something that triggers me and it annoys me? And how do I respond in those situations?
I think also just something I've noticed as African professionals, we tend to take on a different persona when we enter the workspace as opposed to who we are in our natural element. So maybe just also touching on a question that Maloti posed in the chat group. How would one manage the culture conflict between self and the organization? considering that one has to be someone else when they are in a certain space.
Yeah, I think let's look at what Maluti is saying. And I'll immediately say there are two environments here. There is the personal environment and there is the organizational environment. As soon as you move from where you are into the organizational environment, the culture prevailing and dominant would be that of the organization. However, if there is a conflict, you need to be talking to yourself first, Maluti, and saying, where is the conflict? What brings the conflict to the fore? And what it is that you can do to do away with this conflict. And it is when you start grappling with those and realizing that you have moved from one environment to another environment where the collective should be prevailing. Because if you go back to what I said earlier when I talked about individual versus collective cultures that might potentially clash, it is important that we take respect of the fact that the collective will be representing the organization-wide or the team as perspective at the point in time. If you are really becoming uncomfortable because you feel your own personal issues or cultures are being violated, I guess this is where the being courageous in dealing with that issue might also help. But I'm just thinking it would help to acknowledge that the two environments potentially at times might be at conflict with each other. And because you would be in a workspace, unfortunately, the workspace would be the one that emerges and prevails. And the individual that feels aggrieved because there is that conflict might find themselves having to say, how do I deal with it? What would be the best way of dealing and bringing harmony between these two worlds that are at conflict with each other? Thulani, that would be how I look at it, yes.
Thanks, Ntate Mokati. I'm just going to take a question that I received from Rebecca Sevilla. How do you create a culture of trust and sharing of knowledge rather than holding information in power? I trust this is mostly to do with leaders in high positions having to withhold certain information. So I think that's the gist of the question.
Thulani, I think I just read further and I think it also touches on vulnerability. It speaks to a leader being able to cry when things are tough. Mokadi, is that your understanding as well?
Well, the aspect of vulnerability certainly comes in. And if I might take it one step further, there is actually a myth that we need to demystify, that as leaders, when we are vulnerable, it is perceived as being weak. In fact, being vulnerable as a leader is a strength. But if you look at the question that Rebecca is asking, where she says, how do you create a culture of trust and sharing of knowledge rather than withholding information is power? Again, there is also this myth that we also need to demystify this evening, where some leaders, and I'm saying some leaders have this view that says knowledge is power. And this evening, I want to say categorically that knowledge that's not shared is useless. And what is the point of even keeping that knowledge to yourself? I mean, if there is any lesson we need to learn, our own kids are famous of reminding us as parents that sharing is caring. And therefore, if you are a leader who is caring, surely sharing those knowledge, those information, those experiences become key in empowering your own team members. But it also then brings in the aspect of a sharing or creating a culture of trust. I earlier on spoke about two values as an example, and I spoke about authenticity and transparency. Surely a leader who is transparent and authentic would also understand why it is important to create a culture of trust within an organization. But on point, Ilona, it all boils down to whether the leader wants to be vulnerable or not vulnerable. And I want to advise all leaders this evening, being vulnerable as a leader is actually the best thing because it enables you to be in touch with reality as it stands. Thank you, Tulani.
Thank you. Maybe if I can just add, I think latching on to what Mokadi said about myths, there is a huge burden that is placed on leaders, mostly by themselves or maybe by organizational culture and historical culture, that they have to know everything and they have to know more in order to be respected, right? And I think there needs to be a mindset shift that perhaps in that situation, creating a learning organization where we are all constantly on a learning journey. If I am right, I'm right, and it doesn't make me whatever. But if I'm wrong, then it's a learning opportunity. So sometimes fears are associated with sharing of information. It's around fearing being irrelevant. If everyone knows this information, then I have no contribution. Then that person needs to check, are they growing? If their contribution is tied to knowing certain things. And so if the organization is open and thinking about continuously learning, what is your relationship with failure? How do you define when something goes wrong? Is it an opportunity for the team to learn and try again? Or is it an opportunity for somebody to be rated and have that, that reputation of that guy that got that wrong 3 years ago? So some of the things, the small things you can do is to start to think about, how do we behave when somebody doesn't know? What do we attach to knowledge in the organization, and what do we attach to learning and growing and innovation and being creative? And you will find that when it's a closed and no sharing, it could be the reputation around not knowing, the reputation around failing at something that you set out to do. And so somebody fears that if other people then know more than me, then my job is at risk or my relevance is at risk. So it's important to start to even look at the inverse of it. What is causing people not to want to share? What's the fear behind it?
I think the fear, Ilona, if I may add, is self-preservation.
Yeah.
And let's move away from that as leaders. It is not about us. It is about the stakeholders that we lead. There is a concept, if I may just add this concept, Tulani. It's called transpersonal leadership, which promotes moving away from focusing on yourself as a leader, but acknowledging that it is more about the stakeholders, both internal and external, that you are leading. So if you are a leader that wants to preserve yourself and not accept that as a human being, there are certain things that you might not know, we're not going very fast anywhere. So we need to really start appreciating that as leaders, there are certain things that we can learn from our own team members, and accepting that as contribution from our team members makes us better beings than actually wanting to go on this self-preservation mode.
Thanks, Ndatemkhad. Just to bring you back, and I totally agree with the issue of, as a leader, one must be vulnerable. It's actually a strength. I have, however, noticed that that may be abused. And how does one then tend to deal with that in a case of where vulnerability is abused? And just to give an example, for instance, put two individuals, say in C-suite levels, one male, one female. If a male cries at retrenchments, perhaps as Rebecca outlined, that may be considered a strength. If a female cries in the same position, that may be considered as they're really not fit to be in this position of power that they hold. How does one deal with that vulnerability when that is abused?
I'm not sure. Sorry, Ilona. I'm not sure if we are not talking about feministic attitudes here. I want to believe that leadership is not about gender. Leadership goes further than just saying it's a female leader or is a male leader. We need to move to an environment where leadership is not characterized by virtue of one being female and the other being male. And it seems to be that it becomes leadership when it is men dominated. And when it is women dominated, we even say it's women leaders. And I think we need to start moving away from those tendencies. My view, honestly, is in as much as a female, a male leader can be vulnerable, the female leader should also be allowed to be vulnerable. We should not be abusing the fact that she happens to be female, and therefore, because she's female, we will start asking questions like, is she capable enough to be in that position? Why is that question not asked to a male leader when the male leader is also vulnerable? That would be the rhetoric question I want to ask Thulani.
I totally agree with you, but also I just want to say the reality is we're living in a world where gender is being compared, unfortunately, and it's I've seen it even in the art space, for instance, where a DJ is a DJ, but then you have a female DJ. So just for example's sake, so it's culturally entrenched in people. It's not right, but it is there, which is why I'd said, how then do we deal with that? Because it is, I think, a battle that we are still fighting, a battle that a lot of professionals need to deal with. Even when they enter a space, you enter an office, and it's a different feel as opposed to when you see a male and a female in certain positions of power. So while I agree with you on that, I also just want to state that these, I think, are cultural entrenchments that maybe that's something we need to deal with and fight. And then the question will be, how then do we do that best?
Can I make a follow-up on what you have just said? Sorry, okay. I'll give you a chance. I just want to make a follow-up. He says it's a reality. Whose reality is it? Perhaps becomes the question. You say it is entrenched. Why are we allowing it? Maybe let me challenge BMF generally and nationally this evening. I think it's about time, Kanyo, that we challenge those entrenchments that are there. We cannot continue to say things are entrenched. Who entrenched them? Why are we allowing them as realities? Let's start challenging them from today if we were not challenging them. But we cannot continue to say they are realities. Let's actually challenge those realities. That would be my plea this evening. Sorry, Elona, you may come in.
Okay, so I was going to take you right back to Tulani's question. How do you know that the vulnerability is being abused?
Sorry?
How do you know when vulnerability is being abused? What does that look like?
Well, in my sense, for instance, the issue of crying. The issue of crying as a male is often seen as being in touch with your inner feelings and understanding what's going on the ground. From a male perspective, that's how it will be viewed, as if a male leader in a C-suite cries. The issue of a female crying in the same position may be viewed differently. And I think these are to maybe by calling them realities, but and I will call them so because it's what we are going through, it's what we see, it's what we hear on the streets, in offices. You know, these realities are there where we've seen female cry, and it's a different feel from if a Tulani cries or if an Ilona cries. So I will pose that as an abuse of the ones grappling with vulnerability, so to speak.
Okay. All right. So then I can answer your question. So I get you, and I agree that gender is something we cannot run away from. But I'd like to agree with Mokadi that instead of perpetuating some of these things, we need to be able to ask ourselves, but why? You know, so I've coached a lot of men in the C-suite who are actually looking to have a balance in their feminine energy and the masculine energy, because for me, vulnerability is even broader than crying. It's being able to put yourself on the line, expose yourself to potential ridicule, you know, be able to say, I don't know, you know, and that's one of the you know, remembering Rebecca's question, being able to say, that's a difficult question, I'm going to come back to you. You know, that in a large organization address, being able to say, actually, I didn't think of that. You know, I'm going to have to come back to you. Whether male or female, it's being able to say things that you think, maybe I'm going to be laughed at. Maybe my job will be on the line, but resisting the urge of perfectionism when there's no need. For me, that would be vulnerability. And where it comes to crying and I would cast caution against if we are an observer. How do we actually know the intentions and the motives behind somebody putting themselves out there? Because for me, even if Tulani was a horrible person yesterday, if today he's moved to tears, I need to take that today he's moved to tears, because we're evolving beings. So if Ilona is a cold-hearted female leader, but today she's touched by somebody's experience, we need to be approaching these things with humanity, that it's not linear, that just because I tend not to listen to other people, I'm not a growing person, that today is able to put themselves on the spot and say, actually, I never realized this, and take it for what it is. So why am I saying this? Is because it puts so much stress on you, the observer, because you can't control whether I'm faking or abusing vulnerability. It's an observation that might add extra burden on you. Then what do you do with it?
I hear you. I just want to read a response, I think, from Tieti on the positive challenge that you posed to him, Dade Mohadi. In case I don't get to respond to the positive challenge from Mohadi, we look at coaching from the angles of clients. We adopt an approach of adaptability and dynamic flow with the client. We look at what are the specific material and cultural interests of the client. Our approach should be guided by our recognition and openness to the reality that we live in, a world that is conglomerate of diverse individuals and groups And further, thanks Ilona and Mohadi for keeping us in the appropriate direction. Does that is your challenge fully satisfied, Dade Mohadi?
Look, I will always admire the wisdom that THC displays. I think if you look at his response, there's a lot of wisdom in how he has actually articulated his response without saying he might not have the opportunity. So I'm happy with what he has said. Thulani, thank you.
Okay, thanks. I've been advised that we are seemingly at the end of our time. May I request a few parting shots from Ilona and from Untate Mohadi before we close this session?
For me, I'm gonna say a word that's been said often, and maybe somebody will say it's abuse, but we've got to remember that Ubuntu is one of the values that are shared across in South Africa. And I like what Kanyo wrote in the comments about that we need to lift as we rise as leaders. We also look at that even the Constitution is founded on human dignity and seeing other people's worth. I don't think we should be upholding any corporate or any organizational culture that goes against that, because it goes against the very fabric of who we are as a people. And so I think being a reflective person, ask yourself, what happened there? Am I aligning myself to the values that I speak and I preach so much in my daily actions? And if you're not, vulnerability is going back tomorrow and saying, I realized yesterday's conversation was not as it should have been. So it's important as we are leaders, as we're peers, colleagues, and so on, that we check ourselves on the very cultural framework that we say we subscribe to, the values that we speak so easily, but we need to be able to check, is this evident in my actions, in my interaction? When I'm not there, would these people even know that these are the values that I subscribe to? Would they know that I'm part of BMF and I agree with BMF's founding values? Just from interacting with me, just from being my colleague, from being my subordinates. And I think if we're honest with ourselves from that level, there's a lot that you've done already. You can only develop that which you're aware of. So improving your self-awareness, understanding how other people see you and how they experience you and how it aligns with your culture and values is just so important. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ilona. Dade Mohadi.
Thank you, Thulani. My parting words are as follows. One, effective leadership is not about gender. And therefore, it is important that from today going forward, we need to challenge what we term realities when it comes to female leaders. It is time in this country that we actually start saying leadership is leadership and it has nothing to do with gender. That is my first parting shot. My second parting shot is South Africa is yearning for courageous leaders that will shape both the organizational cultures where they are based, but also shape the national culture within which we operate as a country. When Ilona started, she spoke about national culture. And I think within that context, we need to also be saying, what is the African identity of the national culture that we are embracing? And maybe this might be a challenge that we need to look at going forward. My last parting shot is around our determination to make sure that we rise up, we lift as we rise up, Kanyo. And the best way of doing that, one is to acknowledge that determination to be wise is the first step towards becoming wise. What is it that we want to achieve, that we want to start achieving from today, and claiming it and making sure that we start putting all our energies and resources in making sure that ultimately it is that which we want to achieve. And that for me would be what should guide us from now henceforth. Thank you again for having us, and the show continues. So I
Thank
think it
you.
is the next, the 8th.
Yes.
The 8th
Thank
of
you.
August. And yeah,
10th of August.
It's actually the 10th of August. Thank you again, Dr. Mohadi. Thank you, Ilona. Just also to add something that I read in the chat before we sign off, we need to unlearn what has been entrenched within us. That was shared by Michelle Barnes, and that supports what Dr. Mohadi was saying about having courageous leadership. We need to unlearn what has been entrenched in us. With that, colleagues, I would like to say thank you again. And to our viewers, the next session will be on the 10th of August. The title is The Competencies of Leadership, Role Clarity, and Experiences and Beliefs. That will be brought to us by Sazin Dwandwa and Ilona Slatrayo. So thank you again, colleagues. Thank you, Kanyo. From the BMF Western Cape, do have a good evening.